Good morning, everybody. So we are going to go ahead and get started. I have a strong feeling we're going to have a couple of late stragglers, so we'll have some people joining us in a minute here. But my name is Rodney. This is, let's see if I can get this. There we go. We got this. This is going to be our spring soil prep class today. Today we are going to kind of cover all things soil, honestly. Getting ready for the spring, getting out of the dead of winter, right? My name is Rodney. I am the owner of Garden 17. Looking forward to getting to meet everybody. This is only my second class with the slideshow, so everybody bear with me. I know plants and dirt really, really well, but technology not so much. So today we'll kind of skim through some of our topics. Today we're going to talk about soil versus dirt, getting a real base understanding as to what that means for us. We'll talk about our raised beds versus our in-ground beds, how to prep for each of those. We'll talk about compost, potting soils, mulches, and then of course really what we need to do to prep those soils for the spring, right? If you guys have any questions along the way, please do not hesitate to just ask. Again, this is for you guys, so as much as I can answer for you today, the better. But to jump right in, soil versus dirt. So really, the biggest way to look at it is dirt really is used for things like fill, patching a hole in the lawn, that kind of thing. Whereas soil is something that's a little bit more active, typically has a measurable amount of nutrient in it, right? When we are talking about getting ready for the spring, we want to make sure that we're using a good, active, healthy soil to jumpstart typically our kind of dead or dormant dirt, right? Dirt is typically inactive. Right, dirt is usually loams, sands, things like that, right? Where you're not really getting a ton of nutrient value out of those. So we want to make sure that when we are kind of using the difference in terms, if you will, we kind of know what we're actively looking for. A lot of times we look at dirt, like I said, it's kind of a fill soil, right? Something that can give us areas, like I said, holes in the lawn, right? We don't need a ton of activity in those. Your soil is typically going to be the more pricey stuff too, right? That's going to have all those ingredients already in it. And we'll talk about the different brands and such that we carry today as well too. But what we're looking for is something really active to jumpstart our spring and get us those nutrients for the spring growing season, okay? Can everybody see that okay? Is the glare okay? Okay, cool. In these photos here, I just used veggie herb beds as comparison, right, for our raised bed or in-ground bed, but our in-ground beds can also be our perennial beds, our shrub beds, things of that nature as well. Benefits to both, for sure. Does anybody do like raised bed gardening and such? Yeah, awesome, cool, awesome, fantastic, that's great. Anybody do their veggie beds in-ground? All wonderfully smart people. I love it. Our soil is such a pain in the butt for our herbs and veggies, so raised beds is really the way to go. So I like it. So raised beds, really, you get a lot more control, right? That's really the biggest thing. Our soils are actually very nutrient rich. Our native soil, let's call it dirt, right, because it is fairly dead in that way, but it is pretty nutrient rich. The problem is our heavy clay content, it's all locked up in there, and the plant really can't digest it or get active to it, right? So it can't really digest it to make benefit use out of it. So that's why we'll talk about things like compost today and how to activate that. But in a raised bed versus an in-ground bed situation, the raised bed, the big benefit comes from control of your soil, right? So if you are getting into herbs and veggies, or you're getting ready for your spring planting for herbs and veggies, raised bed, if you've got the space and you can, I would definitely encourage you to go that route for sure. In-ground beds, big benefit there is space, right? You do get a lot more space and you can kind of expand a lot easier, but typically an in-ground bed does take a lot more work, right? Like I mentioned, our native soils are really, really locked up. Heavy clay. I don't know if anybody's ever dug in your yard, but the clay content is really, really heavy. So there are some benefits to the in-ground, like I said, space being a really big one of them, but it does take a little more work. Now, when we talk about our perennial beds, where we're putting our beautiful flowers and our natives and such in ground, we do want to make sure we're doing that work up front. You'll hear me say a lot on the floor, soil in your bed prep is like the foundation of your home, right? If you've got a good solid foundation, your walls, will do just fine. If you've got a poor foundation, you'll often see a lot of crack or movement in your walls. Same kind of concept goes for your garden beds, right? So if you've got a really good solid foundation to start with, you're going to have a lot of really good success in the plant health itself, right? But it does mean a lot of unfavorable work up front. That's the physical labor part, right? So any big questions though on in-ground versus raised bed? Again, a little bit of control, a little bit of space, cool. We'll keep going through to the fun part here. Maybe we will. There it is. So let's talk about compost and how to essentially get to compost, right? Compost is going to be really, really active. The way we look at compost is think of it as kind of like a concentrate almost, right? Compost is going to be the really strong, good stuff. Typically, you're not going to plant straight into a compost, right? Compost, going straight into a compost can really cause some burn for your plant roots. So compost is something that should be diluted down. Compost will help break down existing soils. So like I was mentioning earlier, our heavy clay, our soils, like our native soils, right, they're really that heavy, that clay, but they do have a lot of nutrients in it. And so composts help really break that down and give us a little bit more access to that. Now, one of the composts that we carry, that's probably one of our fastest sellers, honestly, is this one here by Nature's Creation. It's just a generalized organic compost, but it does contain the mycorrhiza. The mycorrhiza, yes ma'am?
How much compost to soil?
It's a great question. So depends a little bit on your bed. I typically go about a 50-50 mixture by rule of thumb. So when I'm prepping a hole for planting, I use that 50-50 ratio. So when I prep the hole for the plant, and the way to prep that or think about that is when you are digging your plants, you should be just as deep but twice as wide. Okay, so general rule of thumb is just as deep, twice as wide. And when we look at containers, we're talking about just as deep as our soil level, right? Sometimes our plants can have, or our grow pots can have several inches before that native soil, or the natural soil level inside. So we're looking at that soil level there. So just as deep, twice as wide. Now, depending on where you are in Austin, if your clays or your soils are very heavy clay, I would break up a couple inches in depth extra, but just go ahead and backfill before you put your root ball in. But when I'm prepping like that, that 50-50 ratio is typically what I lean towards. Now, if I am prepping just for the spring and I've got an established bed already and I'm just wanting to refresh, I usually try to use the rule of about a 1 to 2 inch layer of square footage. So I try to calculate to have about 1 inch of compost if I were to think about just spreading it on top as if it was a mulch, right? And then I'll work that into the soil. So usually that works out to about a third of the, instead of a 50-50, it's more of a third ratio. Yes, ma'am?
When you say working into the soil,
Yeah.
how do you do that?
So I would use things like a, what do you call it, pitchfork or the hose, right? You can honestly even use just a spade shovel if you wanted to, right? We will talk at the very end about not getting too close to our plant root balls, right? Because that is always a big thing. You don't want to go and cause damage to any existing roots in the soil. But once you've got the compost spread in the bed, all we're really imagining is literally kind of turning it into the soil as we work it. Now, in an established bed, though, using that ratio, I typically try to leave myself a little ring. And so I'll go a little bit thinner when I get close to my plants, and I'll kind of leave that. I won't shovel that soil in fear that I would disrupt or harm a root, right? So I give a little bit of breathing room depending on the size of the plant as far as the soil that I'm literally turning over, right? Mulch is going to come play a big role in that too, and we'll talk about mulch as well. But really, with a compost, like I said, think about it as a concentrate. It's something that you don't want to go straight into and you do want to work in. So ratio is very important in that way. Does anybody compost at home? Awesome, awesome, love it. Super easy way to get rid of a whole bunch of waste in the yard. That's the way I really think about compost. I did throw in this picture over here on the right. Those are just pallets. Super easy. It doesn't need to be anything, super fancy, right? Those are just some pallets that are put together to create a big rectangular shape. That one looks like it's mostly leaf matter, but it is good to layer your compost. This guy here in the middle, this image here, is showing us that we want a good balance of both browns and greens, basically carbons and nitrogens, okay? You want a well-balanced compost as best you can, but browns are anything from like your dead leaves and newspapers and cardboards, right? Whereas your greens come from like vegetable trimmings, like cooking, prepping dinner, right? Put those in a little bowl, throw them in the compost, that kind of thing. Any fresh leaves can go in for your grain to get that nitrogen too. Grass clippings, the only one I tend to avoid in mine is going to be Bermuda grass. So Bermuda grass is a little bit of a struggle in life, right? Very aggressive, but I do tend to avoid those. But most everything else I would put just straight to the compost. You let it sit. Depends on your compost and such. We do have a compost class coming out where we'll get into the science of that, but depending on how, what kind of nutrients and things that you're putting into your compost depends on how much you're going to turn it, right? But we do have a compost class coming up to dive through all of that. But compost, again, spread in, mix in, whatever the ratio. If you're making a new bed, 50-50. If we're just prepping our existing beds to get them ready for spring, again, plan for about a 1 to 2 inch layer and to turn into the soil, okay? Yes, ma'am?
You were pointing at that bag, and that word is really familiar in front of the word of fungi. Is that
Yes.
how did I say that? Is that an important fungus or something?
Yeah, so the mycorrhizal fungal is basically a beneficial fungus that attaches itself to the root system to help beef up the root system, right?
We get that from compost we make at home?
Not typically. So this is going to be an additive into the soil. So right now we sell a package that's about yay big. It's about the size of a seed packet. And it's just the mycorrhizal fungal, and you just kind of sprinkle it in. If I were composting at home like this method, right, I would add it straight to the compost and let it be active. I will often use it when I'm planting something like a large tree, something with a more established woody root system that's a slow grower to help that establishment a little bit quicker. I don't typically use it on my perennials and such, but there is no harm in using it if you really want to beef it up. So typically what I do in those beds is use a compost that's already got it active, right? But yeah, it's kind of like, are you familiar with liquid seaweed? Okay, it's kind of like the process for liquid seaweed, kind of, sort of, but for the root system, right? Where it's really adding as like it just helps beef things up, right? So it helps kind of speed up the process for the plant.
Oh, great.
Compost too, a little bit chunkier the better, right? We want compost to help us break down our soils. In order for our native soils to break down, to release those nutrients, we need air. Clay has 0 air in it almost, right? Which is why it gets so compact and so hard, right? So the little bit chunkier, the better, to be honest. We want something with a measurable amount of texture to it, right? Mulch, a little bit too chunky, just a native hardwood mulch, right? So if you imagine that kind of texture, a little bit too chunky for your compost. You do want it to be fine enough where it can break down and be digested, essentially, right? So a little bit of a chunky texture, though, is good. Any big questions on compost and how it activates our soils? Doing pretty good so far? Loving it. Yes, please.
If I'm doing container
Yeah.
herbs,
Yeah.
is that the same as a raised bed? Maybe?
Let's actually, I think that's our next slide, so let me slide over to that. So, very similar, but containers are treated a little bit differently. So when we're in a smaller space, so a raised bed, again, thinking of compost as like a concentrate, in a raised bed we still have plenty of square footage where that concentrate can kind of dilute, right? In a container, like a potted situation, right? Great for balconies, patios. Honestly, I have mine all in pots at my house. Potting soil is a better way to go. Potting soil is going to be a little bit more neutral. The one funny thing about potting soil, though, is it pretty much contains 0 soil. It does actually have some compost in it. It's just very, very little. So usually I would lean towards a potting soil for that. My favorite, just general use, is the Happy Frog one, right? Fox Farm makes a really, really good product. You've got a great texture to this. It's a little bit finer in nature too, so it does break down a little bit faster. So you do want to add some nutrients as you go over the years. So in that example, instead of using a straight compost, I would go with something like the Humates, where it's a granular, where it can be digested. The Humates by Microlife is basically a compost, right? But in a granular form. Yes, ma'am?
So literally before playing over here, I
Yeah.
planted a strawberry in that turquoise
Yep. Yeah. Ocean Forest. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Ocean Forest is another really great one. Ocean Forest is, I believe it's a little bit more expensive than the Happy Frog brand. It's just got more in it, right? So it's got more things like the earthworm castings and stuff like that in there. So it's just a little beefed up. Typically, I lean towards that for my tropicals indoors, right? Where they can't get any other nutrients any other way. Yep. But yeah, still a great one. Yep. The one thing I will say about the Ocean Forest, though, outdoors in the middle of summer, it can dry out a little bit quicker. It does have a higher perlite mixture to it, right? So it's a little bit lighter. Anytime we've got a finer soil mixture, the more likely it will dry faster, which is great for your tropicals indoors. But
Happy Frog is a
little bit chunkier. Yep, you got it. So potting soil, up here I've got, we call potting soils typically fairly neutral, of course, unless it's designed not to be, right? A great example of that would be like a blueberry or a rose or a citrus soil, right? Has a little bit of acidity mixed into it. But potting soils are typically made up of mosses, barks, perlites or vermiculites, a little bit of compost, and cocoa coir, typically. Peat moss is often used. We're trying to bring in brands that mostly use the cocoa coir, right? Just a little bit more sustainable, but that's really what makes up a potting soil. The ingredients in the ratios to how you use those can vary depending on the type. And so the Fox Farm or the Happy Frog in the Ocean Forest would be a great example of that, right? This guy's got a little bit more perlite and vermiculite, etc. So it really just depends on what it is that we're potting. Going back to the question of doing the potting herbs, though, so it being fairly neutral, we want to make sure that we're giving some sort of nutrient right out the gate when we're doing a potted anything, really, right? We have a houseplants class coming up, talking about refreshing soils for the spring, right? Usually getting them out of the house back into the shade outside kind of concept. But the same goes for all of our perennial potted arrangements as well, right? Our herbs and veggies, flowering perennials and such. Now, if we think about potting soil being contained like that, every time we water, the water is going to come through the soil and wash out the bottom, right? All of these nutrients that we're talking about are often referred to as micronutrients as well. The more we water, the more likely the soil is to become depleted faster, right? So one thing that we do typically recommend is if you keep things mostly potted in your space, the more likely you're going to need nutrients more frequent, right? Because as we water, all of that's getting kind of washed out of the soil and can become depleted a little bit faster. And because we're not typically using as much of a compost content, right, that concentrate, we are running through those nutrients a little bit faster. That's where the granulars come into play really well when we talk about fertilizers, and we'll dive into those too. But this is going to be a slower release than something like a liquid, right? Now, early in the seasons, I typically lean towards liquids because they're a lot faster acting. Just like drinking water, the plant can digest them a lot faster. But it does mean that they are going to be depleted a lot faster too, being a liquid, right? A granular is going to be something that's slower release. So those are really great for your potted arrangements. Again, if I was doing my herbs, veggies, like I do at my own house, I use this humates all the time. I keep the big 40-pound bag around. Yeah, exactly. You got it.
So if I grow succulents, is there one that's good for
So succulents, honestly, I use the humates as well because it's still packed full of nutrients. So that is a really good one. But the 624 is kind of the typical one that people lean towards on that. It's just a little bit higher in the nitrogen content. Easiest way, is everybody familiar with fertilizers, the 3 numbers on the fertilizers? Okay, cool. So the way that I always tell everybody is, don't overthink them. Leaves, blooms, roots. Okay, that's kind of the way to look at that. Leaves, blooms, roots. Basically, that's what the chemical.
Nitrogen, phosphate, magnesium?
It's NPK. Nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium. Thank you. I was like, what is the K? Why can I think of it? Yes, thank you.
But leaves, blooms, roots is way
It's way easier. Yeah. It's way easier. And the only reason I say that is because we've brought a couple of them out here, and I wanted to kind of show you guys an example of that between these two here. So Fox Farm does really well at their marketing. Love their bags. Eye-catching. Awesome. Tomato and veggie, 573. And then their citrus and avocado, 733, right? Great mixes, pretty similar. However, The tomato, herb, and veggie one that they make, or tomato and veggie, excuse me, is how they have it labeled. I often use this on my citrus over their citrus. I will use this through the winter because of the 7-3-3, leaves, blooms, roots, right? Gives me a good balance. And I'll move to this in the springtime when they start to bloom. This is feeding more of their blooms, right? So it's all about just kind of paying attention to those numbers and what they mean. This guy does have a little bit of added acidity to it, which is great for the citrus, right? And that's why I'll use it through its root development seasons, winters and summers kind of thing. But I will move to this during its blooming season. So again, just a balance of what we're looking at. Marketing is great. It's a wonderful, powerful tool. We love the colors. We love that they're labeled right. But when it really comes down to it, what we're looking at is just what are those 3 numbers doing and what are the other nutrients that have been added to it, such as the acidity, right? So again, just keeping those in mind, as we're feeding kind of thing. Potting soils can also be, like I mentioned earlier, typically they're fairly neutral, but it just depends on, what they've added into it. So of course, always keep an eye on that. There we go. So mulch. So when we are talking about mulch has got that awesome chunky texture to it, and it always makes the beds look beautiful once we're done, right? That's that kind of that cherry on top kind of concept. We have typically the hardwood mulch. The shredded one is the one that I'll lean folks towards. We do also carry the cedar. The cedar's a little bit lighter in color. To a degree, does help with bug repellent is the concept, right, with being cedar like that. Both are going to be really good. They're going to both be what they call the shredded or the triple ground, meaning it's a little bit chunkier than typically our compost would be, right? Benefits of mulch: helps retain moisture and helps keeps weeds out, right? Those are the 2 really, really big things. So mulching our beds before the summer comes is going to be a really, really great tool for you. And the other big thing that I like to do is previous mulch, we mix it right in, right? So when we're talking about adding in our compost to our existing beds and we're talking about that 1 to 2 inch layer across, I'm not pulling up my mulch. I'm putting my compost right on top of that, and as I'm working that compost into the soil, I'm also working that mulch into the soil, right? The mulch has been there for a season and has really flattened and has become basically composted, right? When we see often, is everybody familiar with like the standard hardwood mulches we see? Yeah, pretty familiar. Has anybody seen this kind of white, patchy, kind of fungal, almost dusty, right? Yeah, it's weird looking, right? There's another common one that they call the dog vomit fungal as well, right? It looks a little kind of puffy almost, yeah. They're both really great fungals. This tells us that we've got a really, really healthy mulch. Not pleasing to the eye, but it's a good thing.
Because I was like, oh my God, it's because it was sticky and gooey.
Yes, it's kind of gross looking and it kind of has a bad texture, right? Yeah, it's actually a good fungal because what's happening is that's the activity in our soil, right? We want as much organic matter to break down in our beds to keep a healthy soil as possible. If we only composted our beds once at the initial prep, planted our plants, only mulched once, everything eventually is going to become compacted, right? Yes, ma'am?
What about mushrooms?
Mushrooms are also another great indicator of a healthy soil. The downfall with mushrooms in the wrong season can tell you that your bed is too wet, though. So there's a little bit of trade-off with mushrooms. However, it is a really big sign that your soil is active and healthy enough to produce the mushroom spore.
When's the wrong season?
When it's rainy season, basically, right? That is something I would keep an eye out for. So if I notice mushrooms popping up when we get like a week long of rain kind of thing, I kind of go, oh, I might need to aerate this bed over here, right? Yes, ma'am?
With the tilling the mulch to,
Yeah.
Last year's mulch into this year's
Yeah.
bed, I'm worried about maybe some of my tomatoes, for example, had been developing some like blight or fungus or something, and that I would be working that in and bringing that into the next crop, and they'd actually have. That is a great point that I didn't mention during the composting process as well. If you have affected plants with certain fungals, root rots, and things of that nature, it can thrive in a compost. So you do want to be cautious on what you're composting and what you are working in. So yeah, if you do have things like
a sick plant, anything like that that can live in the soil. Right. So not all fungals do live in the soil. Some of them just live in the plant itself, right? So it definitely depends on the different types, and there's so many of them. I could probably have an hour class about that. Oh yeah, absolutely. There's definitely products to kind of neutralize them or stop them from developing. So yeah, there's definitely ways to treat that. Best way, honestly, to handle that, if you're unfamiliar, is get some good photos. Of the leaves, like a close-up kind of thing, or snip off a leaf and put it in a Ziploc bag and bring it right into us, and we can walk you through that full process. Yeah. But yes, that is something to definitely keep note of. Things like brown patch, right? Stuff like that live in the lawn. You don't want to throw that into the compost because that will maintain its activity. So you do want to be aware of what materials we're putting in our compost or tilling into the beds. But yes, the fungals are good. Tell us that we've got a good active soil. And then the mulch, as it's composting, the chunkiness, if you will, right? The chunky bits of the mulch will become softer, they will decay, and that's only adding good organic matter into the soils. The other reason another reason I like the hardwood or the cedar over like a dyed mulch, like a dyed black or a dyed red, is that in this tilling process, we're putting that chemical into our soil, right? So we do want to be aware of that as an option. Another common mulch that I didn't take a picture of, but I do have a sample here, is the pecan mulch. It is what it sounds like. It's just a pecan shelled mulch. Really, really pretty, a lot different than the hardwood, right? Fairly new to the market in that way. It is a little bit sharper, not a bed you'd walk through barefoot by any means. Does help with the squirrels a little bit. We've had some feedback on that it definitely did reduce some of that because it's the broken shells, they're sharp. So something to consider maybe for like a raised bed even. But what I like about the pecan shell is mixing it into the soil again. Same thing like the hardwood. Every time you're laying in your compost and you're tilling that in, it gives good aeration and drainage material. The biggest goal when we're tilling in our compost or we're turning over our compost and our mulches into our soil, again, is to re-aerate the soil, right? So a healthy soil actually has about 20 to 25% air in it. Seems like a really, really high number, but when you think about a healthy bed, the soil is loose and you can kind of dig in and grab it with your hand kind of concept, right? The air is what's really helping with that. I use a pitchfork, just a standard like 3 to 4 prong pitchfork often, and before I lay in my compost, I'll kind of slightly lift all over my bed with that pitchfork to loosen the soil. That way when I'm putting the compost, it kind of falls in a little bit deeper, and then I just continue to till that right over with the mulch itself, right? You'll notice by the time you're done doing this, and if you do it for about 2 seasons in a row, your bed seems almost like it's lifted, right? Once you've kind of aerated and turned over that soil, it almost seems fuller without you really even adding much material to it. And again, that's because our soils just continue to compress over time, and then we re-aerate to fluff them, right? And they look a little bit fuller, but that's always a really good sign to go, cool, I did really good in this bed, And then of course you mulch right on top of that to help retain the moisture from there. Yes?
So, with you talking about the pecan mulch, so we had tons of pecan trees.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
And I faded them every year.
Yeah, oh yeah.
But I get rid of them.
Yeah.
But I just throw them in like my compost bin and
Totally. Absolutely. Yeah. Now, if you've got, is it like are the squirrels getting to them kind of thing, and they're just leaving shells and pieces around? Yep.
Come and eat all of them.
I was just gonna say, just break them up a little bit before you put them in, because that is technically their seed pod, and if you leave a good healthy compost, they will start to sprout. Yeah. But just break them up a little. Yep. Yeah, so I was gonna say you probably have them everywhere, right? Yeah, so just break them up a little bit. I mean, even just a hammer on a sidewalk kind of concept, just to shatter them. But yeah, throw them right into the compost. Great aeration material, because then when you use that compost and put it in the yard, the shell decomposes slower than everything else, so you still have that nice kind of gritty aeration effect. Yeah. Yes, ma'am?
I don't know much about anything.
No, you're good. That's why we're all here. We love it.
You need to come here. So mulch, you're putting this in raised beds as well as in the ground and in containers, everything.
So you can totally do it across everything. However, I would use a little bit of caution for both your raised bed and your container gardening. And the only reason I say that is most of your container gardening, like in a pottery piece, often your plant height and pottery height and soil height kind of combination don't really allow for a lot of top dress space. And if your top dress, like a mulch, is too high on a plant, you can cause rot right around the base of the plant, kill off the plant, or suffocation, right? So that is a little bit tricky in more of a container setting. Places that I've seen it most effective is like when I've done my tomatoes, something that's got a long stem to it, right? I can use that to help retain some moisture. Not always as needed in a container because inherently we're adding more nutrients. So the mulch isn't as beneficial to as it is to an in-ground bed, right? So you're naturally just adding a little bit more to those beds. And then in a raised bed, same kind of concept. You're naturally just feeding it a little bit more because it tends to be your herbs and veggies in those. So you're already adding a lot of that organic feed matter. But if it is a large raised bed, the mulch really does help retain that moisture. Yeah.
So if you have containers and you put a little bit of mulch on
Oh, totally.
top,
Yeah, absolutely.
just not too much.
Just not, yeah. So typically, like in a container, if I'm doing it in mine, like I said, the tomatoes, I think I maybe had half an inch layer.
Okay.
Yeah. Like whereas in a garden bed, we're closer to like a 2-inch layer. Yeah, I maybe had about a half an inch layer. Yes, ma'am.
So we have raised beds where the previous owner left a really thick layer of pine needles.
Okay. Yeah.
When we get ready to start planting, do you work those in?
Please, yes, yeah. That's a great way to do it. Pine needles also decompose a little bit slower, similar to what we were mentioning with the pecan shells. The pine needles tend to add a little bit of acidity, which is nice. Most of our herbs and veggies don't mind being slightly more on the acidic side than the alkaline side, like our native soils. So yeah, definitely anything organic that you can get into the soil, the better. Right? Leaves, pine needles, pecan shell mulch. I mean, all of it's going to add texture, which is helping with your aeration, right? Texture is something that's often forgot about when creating a good soil, right? You want a good mixture of fine, kind of screened, as well as a little bit of chunky, right? It's just a matter of the right ratio. Something that's too chunky, water's just going to run right through, especially in a raised bed, right? So just making sure you've got a good compost layer in there as well, you'd be set. Yes, ma'am.
This is just a shout out to these classes
Yep.
because I've lived in my house almost 3 years now, and I just started taking these classes last year. And I never did this. Like I never prepped my soil, and so I did it last year. And even my potted plants, like I had never done that. And the difference is amazing. It's like night and day.
Oh,
same.
yeah.
I've seen a huge improvement
Yeah,
since I started.
just working,
Aw.
putting that stuff in the soil. Because I never thought, you go to Home Depot and you might buy a thing.
Totally.
No, did the stuff that you said to do, and even my husband said everything looks so much better.
Great, so that means I can go buy more plants, right?
That's what I told him. I said, remember all those things you argued about when you said, why'd you spend $150 at the garden
Yeah.
place? I said,
Yep.
that's why. So,
Well, that's awesome. Thank you very much. That's really, really sweet. I appreciate that. She's a paid actor, by the way. Yes, ma'am.
So I'm trying to follow because I have stuff
But
on
yeah,
the ground, I have
yeah.
raised beds, I have
Please.
So like for my stock tank things,
Yes.
they're pretty big.
Yeah.
So I want to just kind of till them a little bit with a pitchfork thing.
You got it.
Put a little bit of liquid fertilizer, then put in some of the pecan stuff to keep the damn squirrels out. And is that the process?
That's kind of the idea here. So do you have any sort of top dress in them right now? No, okay, so what I would do is go with a compost, just a thin top dress in there, again, about a half an inch or so for a raise. Turn that in, right? That's going to add that new concentrate nutrient, if you will. And then you're going to transition to using the liquids when you're ready to plant. So if you've started planting and such, yeah. Okay, so yeah, if you've got stuff established already, then right away start with your liquids. That's going to be the fast way to get the plant the nutrient for the season, right? Because we're starting to warm up again at night and everything's wanting to grow again, right? And so that liquid's going to get to the plant faster, right? And then a little bit of a top dress. So if you wanted to go the pecan mulch route, right? A little bit of that top dress, that's what will help you retain that moisture in there.
Do it all at the same time.
Oh yeah, absolutely, yeah. And I will often use in a raised bed. I didn't mention this earlier with the other raised bed question, but just thinking about it with this one, I will sometimes buy a bag of pecan mulch with the compost to mix into the soil, right? Just to get that texture and that aeration. Yep. I don't have a bag, but I do have the sample. I can pass that around. Yeah. Yeah, it's a really good. Yeah, we sure do. Yeah, it's just a really good texture. Like I said, it is sharp in the way that I I'm barefoot often in my yard, and I would not walk around that. Yeah, that's just too much. Oh yeah, go ahead.
So to clarify, what
Yes.
I heard you guys just talking about was, because I was going to ask that, I've got the Hosta lawn fertilizer.
Yes.
Right?
Yep.
That was recommended to me from here like last year.
Yeah.
And I'm ready to get that like on the grass and then on the plants and all that.
You got it,
So
you got it.
we can use the compost and that fertilizer.
Oh, absolutely. Yep. So the thing about the compost feeding the soil itself, whereas the fertilizer is going to feed the plant itself. Yep. Yep. Yep.
Okay.
And supplements, there's plant supplements, liquid seaweeds, super thrives, stuff like that, right? Cool. Okay, cool. So that and a food you can also use together, right? So fertilizer like the Hasselgren lawn, that's going to be a food like a breakfast, lunch, dinner. Whereas the supplement like the liquid seaweed, the super thrives, right? Think of that more as like a multivitamin, right? So you would typically take that with your breakfast or whatever, right? Yep. You can go all at once, right? That's going to be the magic combo. You're feeding your soil, you're feeding your roots, and you're feeding your plant all at the same time.
This is just my backyard, right?
Oh yeah, totally, yeah. Yep.
My beds, they're about a 50-50 mix of transplants like my cucumbers and
Thank you.
potatoes, and then my direct sows like my pumpkins and pole beans. When you're doing direct sow, do you gotta hold back on the liquids? Or will that help the germination?
Liquid seaweed will, but I would go, or even a super thrive would. But in the case of a raised bed, the liquid seaweed goes a little further, so I would probably go liquid seaweed, but I typically dilute it. And on the back, on the little instruction manual that it gives, it's typically 1 ounce to a gallon of water. Right. When you're doing stuff like that, it's typically ½ an ounce to a gallon of water. So you dilute it quite a bit more. Basically what that helps is personally, I probably wouldn't do it, the week that you're doing your direct sow, right? Like I would let things settle, get your normal water, and get things started, and then introduce your seaweed.
Like after I've seen
A little bit of growth, yeah. Like a bean, like you could do it a week later, right? Because you've got some development already happened under soil. You know what I mean? So I would just wait for a little bit of activity, basically. All right, cool. So we've pretty much talked about all of this as we've gone. You guys are great. But basically, really once we understand all the nutrients and all the different pieces that go into this process, this is realistically just talking about the prep of itself, right? We talked last week, if anybody was able to join last week's class, we're pruning our plants, getting them ready for this soil prep, right? We typically clean up from winter and then stimulate the growth, right? We want to get off all that dead wood and such out of there. So if you haven't done your prunings and such yet from coming out of winter, go ahead and start on that before you prep your soil, right? We want to get, like I said, get rid of all that wasted energy first, so then we can bring in the good new energy. But then once we get into our soils, like I said, we've talked about most of this, we're basically kind of getting everything activated and ready to go, but this is the physical tilling part. This is mixing in that compost into the soils. That's how we can really prep it. I did put up here what we typically reference in the ratios: 1 part core, 1 part perlite or vermiculite, ½ part compost, ½ part nutrients, ½ part oxygen, is typically the way that they break that down. But basically, again, these are our main ingredients that go into a soil versus a dirt, right? The soil is going to be the real good, the healthy stuff. It's the active stuff, anything that can add in activity. So once we've got everything tilled, the other things that we can get into is, again, we've talked about compost, right, as kind of being that concentrate. I look at a lot of supplements and nutrients to add into the soils. So what I'll often add, depending on my beds, is we've got all of these different types of micronutrients or supplements to add in as well. Lava sand and green sand are probably the 2 most common to give that texture. The pecan mulch is really great for texture, like we've talked about tilling in. Our hardwood mulch is really great for texture. These guys are a finer mineral that's going to add in texture, but they're also going to add in nutrient, right? So anytime that we can do a double duty is really, really good. You've got your rock phosphates and, of course, your earthworm castings, right? Earthworm castings are going to be the finest of finest soil, right? Like it's got that really, really nice soft texture, whereas these guys are going to have a little bit more of a gritty texture. They're going to feel more like an actual sand. Lava sand is red, and grain sand is literally green. But they're adding in that texture for us as well. These are really, really great when you think about your raised bed or your container gardens too, because that's where we're seeing all of that micronutrient being depleted as we're watering, right? These guys are adding back that activity for us. When we talk about fertilizers in our soil, we're then get into the idea of needing to feed the plant, right? So we've activated the soil, we've fed our soil, now we come back over to now we need to feed the plant that's in there, right? Fertilizers go from granulars to liquids. Granulars are your slower release, really good for your raised bed preps or container gardens, right, like we mentioned earlier, so we can mix those in so they release a little bit slower and they add that nutrient that maybe we can't get it out of compost in those situations. Excuse me, and then you get into your liquids here. Again, same concept, faster acting, get the good stuff, the food to the plant faster. So usually early in season, I will use these and then transition to these and add the liquids when needed. So when I need a little boost or when I need a little supplement. When my plants start growing, I also make sure to give them a little bit of nutrient in there, right? Give them something. The more activity we see from the plants, the more energy the plant is expending, right? So we need to produce that for the plant itself. Most of our plants, unless you are using strictly natives, self-seeding, they're coming up anywhere in the hill country kind of concept, they need something in our spaces, right? So, when we see the flower being produced, we want to give them a little bit of a boost. The liquid over here, what do they call, max blooms or maximum blooms? Yeah, by Microlife 383. Again, that center number, bloom, right? Leaves, blooms, roots. So it's just a matter of how you balance that out with your space.
So how do I know what I need if I'm going to be growing tomatoes?
Yeah, absolutely. So when we think about growing a tomato, we want to know, the way I try to break it down to keep it really simple is what is it that the plant is doing or producing that it might need help with, right? So in a case of growing a fruit, we need first a bunch of good leaves for its photosynthesis process. So early on, I'm going to use something with a higher nitrogen, right? 713. Leaves, blooms, roots. Feed those leaves at the get-go. That's where things like liquid seaweed and root development are really important as well. Right? So that liquid seaweeds like this guy here, or like we talked about the humates, to start with the root feed.
Okay.
And then as it's starting to bloom, or we're getting to the time of season for blooms, I'm going to transition into something with a higher bloom feed to kind of snap the plant along and feed that energy that it's producing into the bloom in the fruit itself. Once my plant starts to fruit, I want to make sure now that it's got a good strong foundation to hold that fruit on, right? And so I go back to the things like liquid seaweeds and humates to make sure that the roots are nice and healthy to support that fruit itself. So it's just a matter of kind of breaking that down sometimes. Gardening can feel scary in the way that the plant doesn't tell us what it needs, right? It doesn't communicate in that way. But plants do communicate in the way of showing us droopy leaves, I'm thirsty, right? Yellow leaves, I'm too wet. Brown leaves, I'm way too dry. I'm blooming, let me help you, right? We communicate and saying, oh, I'm hungry, let's go eat breakfast, right? The plants don't have that ability to do that. So again, if we keep it really simple and consider, I'm blooming, well, I need some blooming fertilizer for that, right? So try to match that up a little bit, and it feels a little safer, if you will, or less scary when you're approaching your garden in that way. To the story that we shared earlier, you will see an amazing difference. Unfortunately, it's not tomorrow. Right, that is the one downfall when we're dealing with plants. It's not tomorrow that this result comes from. So it's always really hard to want to invest in the $10 soil for the $1 plant concept because we don't see that result tomorrow. But do know that in the next season, that's really where the reward really starts to kick in. Most of the time I tell people, don't spend your money on the plant, spend your money on the soil. The theory is put a $1 plant in a $10 hole, not a $10 plant in a $1 hole, right? You will always have success that way. And that goes for potted plants, in-ground plants, right? You name it. But the soil is going to be the most important piece for your landscape, your garden beds, right? Just your flowers in general. Yes?
So we talked through those, the liquids, the
Yeah.
mulch, all that for the raised beds. Is it the same for potted plants? Like I've had potted plants that have been in those pots for years. Is it the same process?
Yes. So typically every year with my potted plants, and actually I just did it last weekend. Obviously being a plant geek, I've got a lot of plants. This poor little jug doesn't go very far for me. I usually get the 40-pound bag of this guy, and this is what I'm putting in my potted plants right now. Some of my plants I need to completely redo the soil, and usually the way to tell that, honestly, I'll pass this one around. This has been in this container since about November, just sitting out like that. You can feel the difference in the soil. It just feels blah. Yeah. And so a good way to know if I need to completely redo the soil in my container is when the soil just doesn't feel like it's got that life left to it, right? It doesn't feel moist, it doesn't feel soft, it's just really dry and it's almost hard to the touch in that way. In between is when I'm using that humates, just to refresh the soil, right? But you do typically about every 2 years. Some people will do it every year, depending on what's in the plant, or in the pot, what kind of plant it is, and just completely refresh the soil itself.
You take the plant out.
Yep.
And then
Clean off root system, put in new soil. Now the soil you're taking out, as long as the plant is healthy and fine, put that right in the compost. Right? That's just going to give that nutrients and again just organic matter to add to that.
See, I'm afraid I would mess up the roots or something.
We can always do it for you. So that is something we offer here.
Can you come to my house and
We do actually. So that is something we can set up, but we can do it on site. Yep. Bring us some good photos so we can know sizes to help know how much soil we would need for that to help you kind of come up to a price and everything. So, yeah. Yeah, but that is something we can do on site like that for sure.
My car's big enough that they're just heavy.
Yes?
Yeah, I didn't know until I was looking at the internet why my roses and my wisteria were so sad. I was like, oh, I'm supposed to pull them out of because those are in containers and redo the soil.
Mm-hmm.
When I started, they're super root bound and, and I know you can prune sometimes the root balls for certain plants, but,
Yeah.
do I just have to get a bigger pot because there's no soil to refresh because it's a big old box of root.
That is the perfect time, honestly, a little bit late in an ideal world to repot into a larger size. So typically what we tell people is when you pull it out and there's not soil around the root ball itself, we're getting crowded.
Is it better to just cut roots? Because I mean, like the pot size is getting ridiculous. Like bringing them in for winter requires like neighbors to get involved in stuff. And I guess it would depend on species, but it's like, can you just start cutting some of that back?
So yes, and you said it was a wisteria and a rose?
Yeah, it's 3 different breeds of roses and then wisteria.
So, but both would take to pruning really well, at least. Definitely depends on the varieties, but typically your general rule of thumb is if you're going to cut roots, you want to cut canopy as well. Because as we take away the ability for the plant to absorb the nutrient to feed the foliage, if you have less roots than foliage in that way, right, you're going to come up with an off balance and you're going to be, lacking nutrients and supplements and such. Now, another way to compensate that is making sure you've got the right nutrients in. So making sure to fertilize and add in your supplements more regularly. So I do have one plant, and love her, but she's never getting into a bigger pot for the same reason. It's just not going to happen in my life. So I use liquid seaweed weekly on that one, and I put in new humates once a month because I know that the soil in there is totally depleted, and I'm just trying to get her a little something, right? Some sort of supplement in there. So I'm using both the liquid and the granular quite frequently, actually. And she's surviving, but probably not thriving, kind of thing.
Oh, okay. So will she eventually die because of that limitation on the size of the pot?
Eventually, yes, but we're prolonging that by making sure it's got enough supplement to digest to produce its energy, basically, right?
I'm really attached to the roses, like
Yeah,
like,
yeah,
like
absolutely.
Sort of personal relationship. So I feel a bigger
Hey,
pot.
yep.
But it'll be like something that needs to have wheels or something now.
For sure. I was gonna say we do have like things with like casters on them, depending on like the weight, but most of them can hold up to about, I think we've got a size that does about 350 pounds, and then another that does I think 500 pounds, if I remember correctly. So they can handle quite a bit of weight for cases like this. But yeah, usually you want to, if you think about the idea of draining all of the nutrients and supplements out of the soil, we need to get them back in there somehow if we can't completely refresh that soil, right? So that's where, like I said, the humate stuff like the humates and a little bit of compost or liquid seaweeds or super thrives come into play. You're just going to want to use them more frequent than recommended, kind of thing, on the bottle for normal use. Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, so you take compost and one of these supplements on the second shelf here and till that into existing soil a little ways out from the plant root ball itself.
Yep.
And then add yourself some mulch.
You got it. You got this. You didn't even need me.
I couldn't say that before.
And just to kind of piggyback on that, the supplements and nutrients and such is just going to depend on your bed and what your plants want, right? So just being aware of that space. Now, as a general use, I would just go green sand or lava sand. Just for, again, just good general use, perennial bed or veggie bed kind of thing. That's what I would go for general use. The others are going to be a little bit more dependent on particular, variety of plant that's in the bed.
Okay, because I don't do veggies because of the squirrels and raccoons, so I've got just plants.
Yeah, just like perennial type bed.
Yeah.
Lava sand, green sand. Yep. Lava sand, green sand with your compost. I would honestly even, is it an established bed or a new one that we're making?
None of them are this year new.
Okay.
Some of them, my butterfly stuff was last year and
Okay.
15-degree weather hurt a lot of it. Some of it's coming back.
So you can, at that step, add in your granular fertilizer. Like if you were to do it this weekend, our long-term forecast is showing us warm evenings, so our plants are going to start growing. So I would use something like a generic 624, mix that in at the exact same time. With all the other stuff, yep.
Then do or don't do the liquid fertilizer?
I wouldn't right away. You could start that like 2 weeks down the road, yep.
Okay.
Yep, because remember, this guy's going to release first, and our plants aren't growing super fast right this second. Yep. I think you were first over here. We'll go down the row. Yep.
Okay, so what happens if you don't really know what soil you have? Because we got our backyard redone.
Okay.
Underneath what the people that did the backyard put, we just had like new home scraps that they just literally left in.
Kind of laid out. Sure. Yeah. Yep. That sounds right.
And obviously a lot of the clay as well.
Yep.
But then whatever that they put on top, it just looks like it's a lot of like sandy stuff, but also looks like some soil, but I really don't.
So that is what is called a loam. So, and likely it was a sandy loam. So was it a builder kind of situation? Okay. So usually builders will use what's called a sandy loam, and unfortunately it is a completely dead dirt. So when we were talking about the idea of activity in our soil versus dirt, loam falls in that dirt category, right? There's really not a lot of activity to it because there's no real organic matter put into it. Usually it's kind of the worst of the worst. Why builders use it though is it's inexpensive and it's really easy to work with. Lawn, like sod, like if you were to put out sod in something like that, would live for a year or two without a problem with the very little bit of nutrients that it's got because it'll just exist, right? But it's inexpensive, unfortunately, is why people go to
So
it.
in that case, should I just like add?
Oh yeah, absolutely. Yeah, you can totally build right on top of that. Yeah, just like we're talking about today and what she was just mentioning, I would grab the compost to mix into that, a supplement to get that micronutrient, right? And depending on what you're planning on putting in the bed, you may or may not just start with a granular fertilizer to start that feed.
Okay.
Yep.
All right.
Yeah, are you thinking about like perennial bed kind of style, like flowers and such?
I already have Esperanza on the side.
Okay.
And they just put the soil like right next to it and stuff. And then on the right, I had a new crepe myrtle that we had planted.
Great. Yeah. Yep.
But again, they just put
Everything,
else
yep.
around it.
Yep.
But I do want to add more stuff too.
Totally. Yep. So I would just start with that compost and such. We talked about your pruning last week, right? So now that we've got all that dead off, right? Now we want to start feeding the plant, and that's where your composting, your nutrients are going to come in. Yep.
You guys have a lot of compost bags this week?
We do. And one thing I was going to say, yeah, right?
Last week?
Yes, we oh yeah, yep. So one thing I was going to say to everybody is that when you get into prepping, if you have a lot of beds or if you just naturally have a larger than average yard, bulk soil is probably the way to go. Okay. Yes, that takes business away from us, but it is so much more effective for how much soil you can get. Whittlesey is a place that's in town. If everybody's familiar, they do a lot of stone and soil type stuff. But Whittlesey is a good company for that, and they'll deliver it, dump it right in your driveway, kind of thing. They're typically very good at helping you over the phone calculate how much you need. But if for some reason they don't, any of us here can help you with that. Typically, you buy it by the yard, which is 27 cubic feet, whereas most of our compost bags are going to be about cubic foot to 2 cubic foot bags. So you get a lot more soil, goes a long ways. And typically a bit less expensive because they're not each individually bagged.
Of course.
For same quantity, right?
Yeah. So when you say the soil that way, it
Yeah.
does not include the compost.
No, you can do the compost like that. So you could do like a bulk compost and then just grab the bigger, like the 40-pound bags of the lava sand or green sand to be able to mix into your beds as you're spreading that. Yep.
Would still probably buy it.
Yeah, well, and we love that, and we've got you for that. We're here for that. And we do offer delivery, so if you wanted to go that route, of course.
Okay.
Yep. Is there a question in the middle here, too? Yes, ma'am.
So I see you've got the grow big, the fox farm
Uh-huh,
grow big.
yeah.
Is that something you recommend for tomatoes, or can I just get what you told me? or-
If you want the ultimate food, the grow big would be awesome for your tomatoes. Typically, I'm going to use these guys in more of a container setting, though. So are you in the raised bed? Is that what you mentioned? You had raised bed. You could use it in a raised bed, but it's not going to be for the cost, for the space kind of thing. I would go more granular or microlife on those for the liquids. These guys are really, really awesome, but they're so packed full of nutrients. But again, you've got the opportunity of putting in compost and such into a raised bed. So I would probably go that route instead. Not necessarily a necessity in your setup, yeah. But in the potted arrangement setup, I would, these guys are concentrate and they're the good stuff.
Can you just mix it in the water?
Just like water, yep. Or excuse me, just like any fertilizer, sorry, just like water. Yes, mix it right in your can.
Okay, so my last question is,
Yeah.
if I am doing a whole new plant, digging that hole,
Yep.
then in ground, what's the best in-ground soil to mix?
That's gonna be the
Oh,
compost.
so just
Yep.
that? So
Yep.
you don't need, so that's already prepped, that's not the whole 50 compost to soil thing that has the soil in it then?
No, so when you're going to prep your hole, it's going to be 50% of the soil that you dig out of the hole and 50% of this compost. Yep.
You just leave that soil that's in the ground no matter how bad it is, even if it's dirt.
Exactly. You're going to mix it with the compost.
Okay.
Yep. You're going to mix that together, and that's what you'll use to backfill the hole. Now, in that same example, I would still add in things like the lava sands in your granular fertilizer for feed, right?
Okay.
If you're planting this time of year forward, basically in a growing season, you're going to want all of those ingredients into the same hole to get that activity. Yep. Yeah, absolutely. Yes, ma'am.
I was reading on one of the gardening blogs, it was like before you add your fertilizer, you need to test your soil. Are they referring to pH?
They are, yeah. You're talking both, actually.
Oh, okay.
So the Ag Extension Program does do a soil test that you can send off for. I want to say it's about $100 or so. You can mail it over to them. However, I would tell you that your soils are, if you are in generally the central Austin or Austin city area, all of our soils are very similar, and everything we've talked about today is going to be lacking from your soil.
Oh, but I've raised beds. That's
Oh, okay. Yep.
stuff I bought, but
Yeah.
I use it every year. You know what I mean?
Yep, absolutely. If you, we could go over the list of products you're using, and I bet you I could get you within reason to know what your soil composition would be like.
So the only way is to get A&M involved? Okay.
So we do sell little kits, like the little home, what do they call them? Home test kit, I guess, to do your soil tests with. So we do have little ones like that. They're great to give you a general starting point, but like I said, if you told us what products you've been using, we could probably guess as close as that's going to for you.
Okay.
Yeah. Any other questions, guys? I think I've kept us a little longer than an hour because I'm realizing the clock back of the room is broken. So that did not help me pace the class. I apologize. It is not 6:30 or 5:30, whatever that thing it thinks it is. So if you guys have any questions, of course, you can always come and find us on the floor. Like I said earlier, bring photos, right? Bring a list of products that you know you've been using. We would love to be able to kind of walk you guys through what is needed. But other than that, come and see me before you go. I've got your $10 voucher for today. But I really appreciate you guys joining me today. Thank you guys so much. Appreciate it, guys. Oh, thank you.